Welcome to the Global Connection, a Tel Aviv University podcast. Journey with us as we discover how TAU's academic community and friends are engaging with and helping to shape this ever-changing world. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Global Connection. I'm your host, Dr. Anna Sajecki. And today I have in the studio with me Dr. Dara Barnat, who is a senior faculty member and head of the Division of Languages at Tel Aviv University. She is also the author of Walt Whitman and the Making of Jewish American Poetry. And Dara originally came to Israel and Tel Aviv University in her early 20s and stayed on to complete her PhD here. Dara is also a poet and author of the poetry collections Headwind Migration, In the Absence, and The City I Run From, Poems of Tel Aviv. It's great to have you here.
Anna, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for your time and your just being able to be here and have this conversation.
I'm really excited to have it. So I figured I'd start off because you actually came here and began your time and your journey in Tel Aviv in Israel as an international student here at Tel Aviv University. And as our listeners might know, the podcast is actually sponsored by the International School, so it's a fun little alignment there. So I thought I'd begin there. If you could tell me a little bit about what the International School was like 20 years ago.
Yes, well, of course, we have to start here. Indeed, I did start my kind of path at Tel Aviv University as a student, as a junior, what was called then a junior, my third year of university. I spent all here at TAU in what was then the overseas program. And I got so much out of that, so much so that I actually finished my BA degree at Binghamton University in New York and came back to live in Tel Aviv after that. And then some years later, not too many, actually, I joined the teaching faculty and in the international school, teaching creative writing. That was back in 2009, I believe, was my first course. I was still a student then. I think maybe a very early or mid-doctoral student, but in any case, I have a lot of history with the staff in the international school and the wonderful students who would circulate through my classroom. And I think a lot of my teaching actually comes from that connection to being here at the university and in Tel Aviv, and of course, even within this country more broadly.
So I do have to ask, is there something unique about being in the atmosphere of an international school? So being with, students who come from all over the world, you've seen it as a student, you've seen it as a teacher. So yeah, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think an international classroom is one of the most special classrooms that can exist, where you have students from the US, from Canada, from Europe, all bring their different languages, perspectives, cultures, interests, and in terms of creative writing, like this can be a lens that through which they view the world, and that gets brought to bear on the writing that they do, whether it's poetry or nonfiction, a little bit of fiction also. But I think the focus would often be nonfiction, so they'd be writing about themselves. And often like the exercises in the class or like the writing prompts would be oriented towards, just go out into the university or go out into the city and choose a place and write about it. And they would bring that back, each one from their own individual viewpoint.
Okay. And I do actually want to have a larger conversation about your poetry. You've taught poetry, you've taught nonfiction. Like you mentioned, you've had activities where you've had students going out to sort of depict place. And I find in your poetry, there are so many beautiful depictions of Tel Aviv that you have. But before we jump into that, I am curious because coming here about 20 years ago, what was your experience of Tel Aviv then? And how would you say it's kind of changed?
It's really interesting. Well, I think I did discover my own poetic voice here, like in very specifically in Tel Aviv. Like I find myself very rooted to place. And because I have been here for this very long stretch of time, and a lot of my experiences are here, just of life and even loss, all kinds of, anything I've gone through in my life, in terms in language and eventual motherhood. I mean, things get filtered, through that. I find myself very rooted, like just in the city itself, in the streets. Um, and I think that I also carry with me a kind of outsider position here. Because again, I've been here for more than 2 decades. I've been at this university teaching, and now in this new role as the head of a wonderful division here called the Division of Languages. I think I reside very deeply in the margins, if in a certain way. Just not having grown up here, I came to Hebrew at a later stage, and all of that. And I think that is part, and I think I because I process a lot of my own life experiences through writing, through
Mhm.
poetry especially, but even sometimes nonfiction writing, that's all in there.
Okay. If I remember the timeline of your poetry, the collections you've published, you really did kind of start with the publishing anyway after you had moved to Tel Aviv.
Yes.
So was there something in that shift of environments perhaps and your experience here that really compelled you to take poetry more seriously as a poet?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I think, first of all, I needed something. I needed poetry at that time. I needed to work out things that I was dealing with through poetry. I think I also met some amazing mentors, poets, that were on faculty who were teaching, and I was fortunate enough to take workshops with him and classes with him. And these are, again, still colleagues that I work with and collaborate with even until today. And I would add, thirdly, and this is something that I've heard other English language writers and poets talk about, that there's something about coming to a place that's kind of unfamiliar that is liberating in a sense, because you're kind of other. You develop a space that can be really like your own, and you kind of have to fill it, and it's destabilizing and disorienting in a way, but in a way that can also be kind of a catalyst for creative work,
Okay.
if that
Okay.
makes sense.
It definitely does. But I'm thinking about some of the work in the city I run from and some of your poems. And I do see how you're inhabiting that space of otherness, but at the same time, I see you as a very conscious poet. And so you're always positioning your own subjective experience in relation to sort of a bigger picture of Tel Aviv, a bigger picture of Israel. So can you talk about that, about sort of positioning yourself in sort of a wider place in all of the stories that inhabit that place?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I have like a particular agenda,
Okay.
um, in that sense, but certainly, my like let's say the chapbook that came out, that was the most recent thing. It's like the city I run from, but it's like, but a lot of for me is how I run from it, but like I always return to it, and actually I'm here.
So what does Tel Aviv mean to you in the poetry that you've written? Because you've mentioned it. It's been you're taking a bit of a break right now. So looking back on the poems, what sort of Tel Aviv arises from that poetry?
I mean, for me, I would say it's the Tel Aviv of the moment. It's a Tel Aviv for me, not necessarily in a political sense, but of like the immediate lived daily experience. Like, this is where I walk down the street. This is where I get coffee. This is what my son sees when we're out in the stroller. And he's not in a stroller anymore, but like when we were, seeing Rabin Square, all the details like that, like are something that I carry into the poetry. I kind of because like I have Walt Whitman as a kind of strong influence. I tend to sometimes go into like an anaphoric mode, or a mode of listing,
Okay.
or
Okay.
like cataloging details. Yeah.
Maybe expand on that a little bit. So Walt Whitman, you are an expert on Walt Whitman. You've studied Songs of Myself very much in detail. So how does he influence your poetry? So when you say cataloging, like even what do you mean by cataloging?
So cataloging, it's like so it's a something in poetry that's like where you bring in lists of things.
Hmm.
So sometimes that's like can be I mean really it can be anything, names or street names or fruits and vegetables. I mean really it can be anything. And sometimes I find myself using or kind of adapting that style that's
Okay.
like traditionally associated with Whitman. And
Okay. So in his work, how does he catalog? What sort of things does he catalog?
I guess you can ask, like, what kind of things does he not catalog?
Okay,
Because I
fair,
know he
fair.
writes these very hugely expansive poems that are, where anything can be brought in, people, places, things, nature. I mean, just like there's almost nothing left out of there. And that's why the poems are also like so long, that they're supposed to be very inclusive and democratic and kind of they're supposed to allow everything and everyone in, even like people who, like, let's say, are marginalized or invisible, like to bring them in and sort of have them be present to the reader.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is there's a sort of sense of responsibility behind cataloging. It's trying to be as representative as you can be.
Yeah. It could be that there's actually something very democratic about that. And I know that about Whitman. I haven't thought about it for myself, but maybe you're actually seeing something that
Okay,
I hadn't seen, that there is a democratic kind of element to that too in relation to Tel Aviv. And yeah.
okay, interesting. Are there other ways you've been influenced by Whitman in your work?
Well, my I have such a love of Whitman's poetry in particular. Um, I think that the early like there was a time when I was looking for a topic for my dissertation where I read all of the editions of Leaves of Grass and was just really taken with it. And I was lucky enough to be able to teach courses on Whitman, both here at TAU and abroad for CUNY. So I've had many classes also where we dig in and we analyze these texts. And I think for me, it's the rhythms, it's the music of it. Just on that level. Like if you're just to not even analyze the meaning of it, but you just listen to, you just like read it aloud, or just it's the language and the alliteration, which is like where you have a repetition of like consonant sounds, basically. Um, all of that, the sound patterns, reach me. There's something very prayer-like about Whitman's poetry, which also like relates to a lot of Jewish American poets, which has been my subject of research for quite many years now. There's also like very often that's like a thread that runs through some of the responses to Whitman.
Okay, okay. Um, do you mind if I ask, since we're on the topic, can you elaborate a little bit more on that in terms of how Jewish American poets pick up Whitman? And it sounds like there's that rhythm and that prayer-like attention to language.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes it relates to that. Sometimes Whitman, because he was like a very democratic and even kind of outsider poet, although now he's not really considered that way, but he was for a long time, that there are poets, Jewish American poets from like the earliest 20th century, like in the time of high modernism, who were sort of othered themselves, like within the little literary world and just like politically. And so Whitman was like a poet that they adopted to kind of, well, first of all, yeah, to mark themselves kind of as American, to like be part of that tradition, but also claim something much more social, much more democratic, and with
Okay,
with almost like a social justice like element to it, I'd say.
okay, okay. Um, since you mentioned rhythm, one thing that I picked up on your poetry, when you um, in your poems, when you're representing Tel Aviv, there are multiple times when you turn to the Mediterranean specifically. And in terms of rhythm, I almost feel like there's this fluidity of water, this motion, and I kind of sense that rhythm in your poetry. I could be way off, but is that something you've picked up on too? Is the Mediterranean itself meaningful in your poetry?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, okay, so I do think if there's a place for like anyone really to go to like kind of be somewhere and have an experience that's like very unique to Tel Aviv and to just this place, or for a student, to just go like do some writing, just just like on the beach, early in the morning or late in the evening when not a lot of people are there is a very like inspiring place. And I think because I was here from a relatively young age, even before like my early 20s, like when I was here as a student myself, we would go there a lot. And I wasn't even writing poetry at all then. It wasn't really like something I was engaged in. I don't think I'd found my poetic voice yet, or it wasn't engaging like that. But I definitely have a lot of memories of just being there, myself and seeing something greater than myself. And yeah.
Okay, okay. So it's partly that idea of that expansiveness, that it's greater than yourself. And I wonder too if it's partly the contrast with the city. The city full of people and buildings and ideas and stories, and then there's the Mediterranean.
Yeah, and it's always amazed me here that like you can go there and it can be like a bustling city, like so loud, and now it's even more with the construction and everything, but you can find times of the day like maybe again like I'm not so much like there in the evening, but like certainly you can go in the morning and be almost alone there, and that would really strike me and I think stayed with me
Okay. Um,
now that you mentioned it.
yeah. Well, and in your work too, like you do again beautifully capture these moments of the city, but you will always hold a sort of not as busyness, but there's sort of an activity very much aligned with the city, with sort of these images of, I would say, eternity or nature. So I'm thinking there's another poem you have. I forget the title exactly, on the way to Beersheba, but you end with this image of sand kind of taking over everything too. And so do you think a lot about that relationship between city and nature, between sort of the moment and even eternity? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. I do think that poetry can give us something very unique when it comes to the eternal. I mean, because first of all, like a poem can live eternally, even beyond a human being, And I think for me, nature plays into this idea of sometimes loss or like experience of grief or difficult experiences, that one can go through in life. And something about the eternal like resonates for me. It's almost like a hopefulness, actually. It's not just like, okay, this very difficult thing has happened. That's the end of it. But there's something beyond that. It's almost optimistic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So and I noticed too that you do, when you, in your work, when you're addressing grief, you're often looking to hope at the same time. And you have this sort of vacillation between ideas often. So grief and hope, familiarity and strangeness, even the desert and flooding. So what is it about wanting to go back and forth between these ideas? What does that mean to you?
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, a couple of things come to mind. Like, I think that one thing that I often teach is that a poem can contain contradictions. In a way, sometimes a poem will speak to us because life is full of contradictions, and a poem can hold these things together and in a way that to me can be very satisfying, because oftentimes situations, our experiences are complex, they're and we can feel one way one day and something else another day. And I'll say that Walt Whitman too, like there's a strong element of contradictions, in Whitman, and it's an embrace of contradictions. And I think that there may be something also from his poetry that I kind of took from that. Like you can contradict yourself.
Okay. Okay. And so that contradiction, that holding two opposing ideas together, that's partly just about the complexity of how we live too, and trying to capture that.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I know you've, as a director of the Division of Languages, you're maybe not teaching poetry and writing as much these days, but if you were to give advice to potential poets that we have, in terms of how do you go out around Tel Aviv and look at it poetically, what would be your advice there?
I love this question. As a teacher, I love it. Um so okay, first of all, I would say like if you're new to this, or even if you're not, like you can go out with a sense of curiosity, like rather than criticism, because I think sometimes, especially students in the beginning, and not just students, everyone, like they're kind of apprehensive about writing, and what that's going to bring up for them. And I would say, okay, first of all, start with a perspective of curiosity rather than criticism. And then take yourself somewhere new, go to like a new place. And this has been one of my creative writing exercises. Like I say, don't go by yourself, but like go somewhere, go to the beach, go to a new street you've never visited, go to a new restaurant, go to a new place on campus that you haven't been before. Go check out a statue or go to a museum. I mean, it's endless. And just write about it. That's it, without too much direction or worry about it. Just respond to what you see.
Okay. Okay. Well, I feel like that is an activity I'm going to encourage everybody to go out and try a little bit and
Wonderful.
get to know Tel Aviv a little bit more.
Well, I hope they would enjoy it and they should. And thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you, Dara, for joining me
It
today.
was my pleasure.